Welcome to the Republic of Philosophy. My name is the Republican, and today I'm going to be reading the preface of Nick Land's Thirst for Annihilation, George Bataille and Virulent Nihilism. This is the preface. As though to give yourself a certain positive assurance, which harboured as well a suspicion of superiority, you have often reproached me for what you call my appetite for destruction. The reasons for writing a book can be led back to the desire to modify the relations which exist between a human being and its kind. Those relations are judged unacceptable and perceived as an atrocious wretchedness. However, to the extent that I have written this book, I have been conscious that it is important to regulate the account of that wretchedness. Up to a certain limit, the desire for perfectly clear human exchanges which escape general convention becomes a desire for annihilation. I've always unconsciously sought out that which will beat me down to the ground. But the floor is also a wall. What best befits an author is to preface a work with an apology, with its apology, ornamenting it with the guilt of necessity. After all, one should not beg attention without excuse. That a writer provides some rudimentary justification for a book seems a modest enough expectation, but such a demand obliterates me, since this is a text which has been reared in perfect superfluity, clutching feebly at zero. There is not a single sentence which is other than a gratuitous and a confusion, a cry at least half lamed and smothered in irony, which appeal that is made to the name Bataille shudders between a pretension and a joke. Bataille. I know nothing about him. His obsessions disturb me. His ignorances numb me. I find his thought incomprehensible. The abrasions of his writing shears uselessly across my inarticulacy. In response, I mumble as a resistance to anxiety, maddening myself with words, locked in a cell with my own hollow ravings, but at least it is not that. And even now I lie. In truth, Bataille seems to me far less an intellectual predicament than a sexual and religious one, transecting the lethargic suicide upon which we are all embarked. To accept his writing is an impossibility, to resist them an irrelevance. One is excited abnormally, appalled without refuge, nausea perhaps. Such melodrama comes rapidly to amuse, although we still vomit just as we die. So I tried to persuade myself that it would have been relatively straightforward to write a sound book on the work of George Bataille, a book that would have discussed the contribution he has made to the philosophical and literary culture of the 20th century France, exposing his doctrines of general economy, base materialism, and atheology, appraising the excellences of his various prose style and his poetry, recommending that his work be invested by serious reading, scholarship, and eventually a judicious estimation. By my reckoning, a schlecht book. Such books are always depressing enough, but in the case of Bataille, the situation is even more acute, touching on something akin to the pure pornography characterizing our contemporary Nietzsche scholarship. To succeed in writing a book of any kind about Bataille is already something wretched, because it is only in the twisted interterrestrial spaces of failure that contact, infection, and, at the limit, the anomic and goic intimacy that he calls communication can take place. A recovery of the sense of Bataille's writing is the surest part to its radical impoverishment. It is as pathetic to seek education from Bataille as it is to seek comfort from Nietzsche. Bataille is, of course, somewhat more honest than this about his own hypocrisies. There is no doubt that to season Bataille in preparation for his comfortable digestion by capital's cultural machine is a piece of twisted prostitution of the kind we would fully have appreciated, the delicious obscenity. A writer who tried to help us to expend, stored away with all the others in our reserve of informatico financial assets in order to be pimped out into the career flows of Western academics. There are North Americans who have already learned to gurgle Bataille contra Marx, for instance. Although the issue is rarely this inanely ideological, more insidious is the he was a librarian, you know. Bataille increasingly snarled up in the deconstructive pulp industry of endless commentaries on logocentrism, Western metaphysics, and the various Swergish Seinhalle, the Bataille who read a lot and had something very clever to say. Bataille may be praised or condemned in terms of his erudition, but this scarcely matters when compared with his sanctity as a voyager in sickness. But books make good burrows in which to hide, and few places are as redolent of the little escapes as a library. The shelves of fiction, history, geography, each book a pretext for derealization, patiently awaiting the moment when it will be coupled to some vague reverie. Not that this book makes any special pleading for itself. It has scratched about for needles in the most destitute gutters of the earth, cold turkey crawling into its knees, and begging the Academy to pimp it ever deeper into abuse. Ever since it became theoretically evident that our precious personal identities were just brand tags for trading crumbs of labour power on the libidino economic junk circuit, the vestiges of authorial theatricality have been wearing thinner. Who cares what anyone thinks, knows, or theorizes about Bataille? The only thing to try and touch is the intense shockwave that still reaches us along with the textual embers. For as long, that is, as anything can still reach us, when Descartes needed God to mediate his relations with his fellows, secular man is happy with his television set and with all the other commodified channels of pseudo communication with which his civilization has so thoughtfully endowed him. Such things are for his own protection, of course, to filter out the terrifying threat of infection. If openness to alterity, base communication, and experimental curiosity are marks of an exuberant society, its only true gauge lies in its tendency to be decimated by sexual transmitted disease and a nihilist religion. On this basis, it seems that our society, despite its own most strenuous efforts, has not yet consummated its long idealized scoliosis into impermeable atoms. The grid still exists, and it is only amongst the grit that we connect. It is 3:30 in the morning. Let us say one is drunk, an impoverished cipher for all those terrible things one does to one's nervous system in the depths of the night, and the philosophy is impossible, although one still thinks even to the point of terror and disgust. What does it mean for this episode in the real history of spirit to die without a trace? Where has it strayed to? I thought of death, which I imagined to be similar to that walk without an object. But the walk in death takes its path without reason, forever. An extraordinary lucidity, frosty and crisp in the blackness, but paralyzed, lodged in some recesses of the universe, that clutches it like a snare. A wave of nausea is accompanied by a peculiarity insinuating headache, as if thought itself were copulating unreservedly with suffering. A damp coldness, close to fog, creeps through the open window. I laugh. delighted at the fate that has turned me into a reptile. The metallic hardness of intellect seems like a cutting instrument in my hand, the detached fragment from a machine tool or an abattoir seeking out the terminal sense it has always refused. The object of philosophy, insofar as the reflective meditation upon thought can be taken to characterize it, is arbitrarily prescribed as undisturbed reasonings. The cases of psychopathology, psychiatry, abnormal psychology, etc., do not remotely contravene this rigorous selection, because such studies of disturbed thought are constituted in principle without entanglement. It is thus that successfully adapted, tranquil, moderate, and productive reason monopolizes the philosophical concept of thought, in the same way that the generalized roboticism of regulated labor squeezes all intense gestures of social existence. My abnormal devotion to Bataille stems from the fact that nobody has done more than he to obstruct the passage of violent blanks into a pacified oblivion, and thus to awaken the monster in the basement of reason. Not that the repressed is locked in a dungeon; it is stranded in a labyrinth and connected to the daylit world by a secret continuity. A tangle of confusion comes to seem like a door, a maze, like a barrier, and one says, "I." But the inside is not a cell. It is a corridor, a passage cut from soft rock of loss. Inner experience traverses a somber porosity, and the moans of the Minotaur reverberate through its arteries, hinting at an indefinable proximity. It becomes difficult to sleep. Of course, I indulge myself in innumerable ways. I tell myself the personal pronoun fails to mark the pseudo-neutral position of a commentator this time. That is rather a protraction of Bataille's incessant je into a further episode of debasement. For it is remarkable how degraded a discourse can become when it is marked by the obsessive reiteration of the abstract ego, mixing arrogance with pallid humility, the chronic whine that results something akin to the degenerated reverberation of Dostoevsky's Underground Man, is the intensity of a humanity that has become an unbearable indignity. I am alone, as the tasteless exhibition of an indigenous torment, as the betrayal of communication, as a festering wound in which the monadic knitting of flesh loses itself in a mess of pus and scabs, etc. You yawn, of course, but I continue. Yes, I am definitionally a filthy beggar, like God, scrambling at the coattails of a reluctant and embarrassed attentiveness driven into a guile that fuses wretchedness with an elusive element of threat. Is it mere indolence that defeats all tendencies towards decorous impersonality? Scarcely, or rather, I cannot bring myself to think so. I nag at the margins of this discourse on the writings of George Bataille as a hideous confirmation of its cowardice and moderation, simultaneous with the dreariness of its prostitution, a wheezy parody of laughter teetering upon the abject nakedness of a sob. Yet at the same time, it scarcely matters whether I write of Bataille or myself. If there is a boundary between us, it is only insofar as he was momentarily frustrated in his passage to the truth of his text. Bataille's writings exhibit a marked attachment to the first-person pronoun, and the confessional mode is especially predominant in his more literary works, although it spreads almost everywhere. The most obvious consequence of this device is to immerse the narrative ego in the text, fusing voice and discourse in a field of eminence and putting identity unreservedly into play. Not only is most of the fiction published during Bataille's lifetime narrated in the first person, including The Storm of an Eye, Madame Edwirna, Impossible, The ABC, and The Blue of the Moon, but in every case more than one confessional voice is involved. Even after the various egos of dialogues are excluded, whether this is the result of the authorial prefaces or stratified narrative structures. The ABC, for example, includes no less than 3 distinct first-person narrative voices and temporal ruptures in order of its discourses complicate the situation still further. There is an unmanageable appeal, a plight of isolation, a voice resistant to all delineation, an infection, so that reading Bacchae is not a contribution, but a positivity, but a plea. It does not befit beggars to garb themselves in the robes of proud neutrality. The matter is quite the contrary. No one sinks beneath the burden of individuality as they do. If beggars are so often driven to religion, it is because they can never be in the rational interests of anyone to respond to them. They must inherit the tradition of unanswered cries encrypted in monastic cells. These mendicants have certainly been destituted in an echo of death of God, but with no space awaiting them in the secular order, they are forced to live their limitless impoverishment as an impossible necessity. As, for myself, Bataille, also the matter is altogether comic, is more comic. Do not think I am unsympathetic. These tickets of abstract identity are no doubt unpleasant to stumble through. The scrawny little sign of promiscuous individuality is a perpetual aggravation, reminding you in each case of your own incarceration by self. That enunciation should be harried by an I is more stylistic. In flacity, it is a loathsomeness, and yet the only routes of evasion leading away from it are hypocritical. To try and hide the manaclescars which wreck the complexion of the text would in itself be a decisionistic celebration of autonomy, debasing the text further, branding it even more conclusively as servile matter out of which the ego has transcended into invisibility. Write oneself out of a book can be many things. The dilettantism of one for whom writing is from the start affection and artificiality, the professionalism of one for whom a book tends to anonymity, if not immediately to that of the commodity, at least to that of career capital, the authoritarianism of one lost in a monological insanity close to solipsism, or the all too ostentatious humility of one who prefers to guide from behind the scenes. It can be genuine timidity, pomposity, inertial apathy, even experiment, but what it can never be, for as long as it is remotely deliberated, is flight. It is still tempting to renounce the posture of the first person, even though its force of corrosive qualification reduces the risk of complacent objectivism or pseudo-collectivity. The indulgences of personality, of spurious autonomy, responsibility, and idiosyncratic affection are sufficiently repelled to provoke a measure of tactical carelessness. One paralyzes a dimension of messy affectivity out of distaste, but to write of Bataille in such a way is more than a little absurd, suggesting, as it does, that impersonality is a simple thing to achieve. After all, the I, quote unquote, is not to be expelled but submitted to sacrifice. When shuffled about within a text upon Bataille, it is compelled to refer not to an author, but rather to an ennui, gesticulating at the void, the symptom of an abstract, tragic community. And we'll leave it there for this time. And we will read the rest of the preface, the next reading of Nick Land. Till next time, take care.